So I'd like to begin with a short quote from the anti-pesticide mother of us all, Rachel Carson. This is what she said: "Man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." I think we can agree to forgive Carson for the outdated sexism of those man references, especially since it's pretty clear that it mostly was men who are in charge of the war against nature. And remarkably, the opposing players have not really changed in the 57 years since she wrote her brilliant cry in nature's defense. After Silent Spring was serialized in the New Yorker in June 19, did you all know that? You aren't old enough to know that. It came out in the New Yorker in a serial form in 1962 before the book was published. And she forecast, lost my place. After Silent Spring was serialized in the New Yorker in June 1962, American Cyanabid forecast that questioning pesticides would lead to a, quote, return to the dark ages, when, quote, insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. And guess who? Our old friend Monsanto published and distributed a pamphlet parroting Carson's most arresting chapter about a town where all life had been silenced by the cumulative effects of DDT. Monsanto's pamphlet, entitled "The Desolate Year," described the horrors of a world devastated by famine, disease, and insects because chemical pesticides had been banned. And of course, the then Secretary of Agriculture agreed that we could never feed the world without pesticides. Does that sound familiar? An argument which remains chronically appealing, if usually misleading, since we have never fed the world. And today, when millions are hungry here and around the planet, we devote a major portion of our presumably food crops, our cropland, to corn that's fed to confined animals who should be grazing, or turned into fuel alcohol for our cars, or high fructose corn syrup for our junk foods. It has long been clear that we do not need more food to feed the world. We can now feed 10 to 11 billion people, so those 9 billion that Monsanto is always talking about is a fraud. But the hunger argument is always good for business and allows one to paint critics as cruelly indifferent to the suffering of the poor. Prompted by this invitation to speak, I found myself thinking back to the years when I first began to understand the implications of the fact that on a finite planet, infinite growth was not possible, and that because the Earth is a globe, anything you throw over your shoulder comes up in front of you and hits you in the face. Early in my learning curve, I found a book which I actually managed to locate in my current library called Insects, Experts, and the Insecticide Crisis. Published in 1982, it has a whole section devoted to resistance and contains, among other things, the following sentence that explains the crisis of the title. Quote, "The instability of insecticidal technologies," that means the inevitable development of resistance, plus the fear of environmental contamination, were the primary problems debated from 1950s through the 1970s. That sentence says that way back in the 1950s, over 60 years ago, the purveyors of a post-World War II arsenal of novel, pest-killing chemicals knew that resistance to those chemicals would occur, so that farmers who became dependent on any single product would regularly need to shift to something new. They also knew, now that Carson had pointed it out, that the poisons of which we were trying to exterminate everything we viewed as threatening to us or to our crops were working their way up the food chain that we sat on top of, poisoning on their way lots of other things in the environment besides the particular pest being targeted. It's important to keep in mind that at the time the book was published, almost 40 years ago, lots of non-chemical approaches to controlling crop pests had been familiar to professionals for decades. Among them, the development of insect-resistant strains of crops, insect pathogens, biological control, sterile males, hormonal control of insect growth, alteration of farming practices, organic production, for example, mechanical devices, the use of resistant crop plants, and so on. But only chemicals had the backing of profitability behind them, and they were modern. But something even more modern was even then on the horizon. In June of 1982, the same year the book on the insecticide crisis was published, the House Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight of the Committee on Science and Technology held a hearing on, quote, potential application of recombinant DNA and genetics on agricultural sciences. So the biotech race was on. Biotech was insistently touted at its introduction as a solution to the problems of too much pesticide use on plants because they were going to build resistance into the plants. Well, we all know how that turned out. Plants were engineered to resist insect pests, and pesticide use did initially go down. But Monsanto also engineered corn, cotton, and soy to resist a weed-killing chemical called glyphosate formulated into an herbicide called Roundup, which was touted as a miracle method of weed control. The adoption rate of this new miracle was touted as was phenomenal. The percentage of U.S. crop acreage planted to Roundup-ready corn, cotton, and soy went from 0 in 1996 to 90%. That's the percent of acreage involved in genetically engineered crops. 20 years later, it was 90%. Herbicide use went through the ceiling. By that time, just as many observers had predicted, superweeds, untouchable by the herbicide, had invaded more than half of U.S. farms. It looked like it was time to try another approach. Right? Wrong. Monsanto, slipping out from under its increasingly damned reputation, folded into Bayer, which introduced 2 new genetically stacked versions of soy, one resistant to both glyphosate and an older, more toxic pesticide called 2,4-D, and another resistant to a truly lethal old pesticide called dicamba. Dicamba-resistant soy was widely planted almost immediately, and because the pesticide is extremely volatile and moves off to places where it isn't sprayed, we've already seen a picture of what happens to peach trees. Dicamba has already caused widespread damage in surrounding fields and backyards to fruits, vegetables, commercial and residential gardens and trees, including orchard trees. It has put some farmers out of business, and others have been forced to buy dicamba-resistant seed because they can't afford to risk losing their soybean crop and by planting the variety that they really want to, which is a wonderful marketing method. But of course, resistance inevitably arises to these new fixes. We already have farmland everywhere infested with weeds like the giant Palmer amaranth that has appeared in Roundup-resistant fields, a weed so huge that the only control is to send in workers to chop it down. So it should, alas, be no surprise that just about a month ago, a Palmer amaranth weed resistant to both 2,4-D and dicamba was reported in a field at Kansas State University. All of which is to say that our agriculture is more deeply trapped in a chemical web than we were before GMOs were invented as a solution. So the question with which we all need to grapple is what we can do about this mess that threatens not just our species, but the living world. First, of course, we need to face up to the reality that what we're doing isn't working and isn't likely to. Next, we need to stop getting fixated on specific chemicals, on the bad guys, since we can't eliminate them one by one within the lifetime of any of us, or our children, or their children. Therefore, our energy and our political efforts should be focused on phasing out all pesticides, period. I recently heard that some such movement was seriously beginning in Europe, so the idea is not off the global table. Fourth, we need to encourage and support agricultural systems, organic, sustainable, regenerative, agroecological, that have demonstrably produced bounty without toxics, thus eliminating the major market for these chemicals. Finally, to protect ourselves in the present, we need to seek out minimally processed foods produced without such poisons. Certified organic is still our best option where it's financially possible, opting for the greatest possible variety to spread our risk whenever safety cannot be assumed. And so to close, given the pace of global warming, It may well be that preponderance of the Earth's living creatures will be wiped out by climate change before they are killed by the chemicals we are dousing them with. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the 90% decline in monarchs, the 87% decline in rusty-patched bumblebees, and probable declines at the same scale among the rest of the insects, leading serious scientists to warn of an insect Armageddon. These deaths are simply the latest visible consequences of our war against nature. And of course, without insects, we will all die. In Rachel Carson's words, our war against nature is a war against ourselves. So we need, if only selfishly, on behalf of our own species, to do everything in our power to end the chemical onslaught. Thank you.
Get a head start preparing for the changes that are coming. The industrial economy operates on the basis of maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. Now, if you think about that, there isn't anything in that paradigm about resilience or sustainability or those things that we're all concerned about. Coming out of the Enlightenment, we began to see ourselves as somehow being separate from nature. And so we began to believe that we could control nature, that we could dominate it, that we could make it do what we wanted it to do. We have to recognize that we are now reaching a point where this approach, this system, is not going to work anymore in the future. It's so often so easy for us to simply say, well, the farmers are doing all these wrong things and they should change and we got to get them to change. But we have to recognize that we all have to change. We got to change the market system. If we don't diversify the market system, then farmers are not very likely to diversify their farming systems. So it's a part of, we all got to become engaged in the process. We have to understand and appreciate all of the gifts of nature.